You know, darlin', in a life filled with words, the loudest moments are often the quiet ones. The silence that hangs after a cruel remark. The stillness of a side of the bed that stays cold. The quiet click of a door closing on a dream. We spend so much of our lives trying to find the right words to make ourselves heard. To argue our point. To beg for understanding. We raise our voices, thinking volume will convey our pain. But let me tell you something I learned out on the open water, far from any shore. What I found on that ship was louder than any argument I ever had at home. It didn't shout. It didn't plead. It didn't have to. I want you to try something with me right now wherever you are. Just for a moment. I want you to be still. And I want you to listen to your own breath. The sound of the air moving into your body and leaving it again. That quiet tide. Most of us we go whole days without hearing it. We treat it like background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator, something that just happens without our notice. But let me tell you a story about breath. About my breath. For most of my marriage I believe I was holding mine. Not in the dramatic sense, not like I was underwater. It was subtler than that. It was a constant gentle constriction, a habit so deep I had forgotten I was doing it. I breathed in the shallow way of someone trying not to be noticed. The breath of a woman smoothing her skirt before she sits down. The breath of waiting. Waiting for his key in the door. Waiting for his opinion on the meal I cooked. Waiting for the sigh that meant I had gotten something wrong, the slight puff of air that was more cutting than any curse word. My lungs never fully filled. My shoulders were always a little raised, just a hint, just enough to guard my heart. I lived in a state of quiet anticipation, which is just a polite way of saying I lived in fear. Not fear of a raised hand. Nothing so clear. It was the fear of a mood shifting like a weather front moving in. The fear of the cold shoulder that could last for days. The fear of my own voice saying the wrong thing and making the silence worse. So I held my breath. I made myself small. I took up less air. Less space. I thought I was keeping the peace. I was simply vanishing one quiet breath at a time. The first night on that ship in my little cabin with the porthole looking out into the black, I could not sleep. The bed felt strange. The room hummed with the engine, a sound I could feel in my ribs. And I realized with a start what was missing. It was his breathing from the other side of the bed. The familiar raspy rhythm I had listened to for 33 years. The sound I associated with night itself. It was gone, and in its absence was a void, a silence so complete it was dizzying. I lay there in the dark and I felt a panic, a childish one. I was untethered. The weight that had held me down was gone and I felt myself floating away. I sat up. I put my feet on the cool floor. I walked to the porthole and I looked out at the nothingness. No city lights, no familiar rooftops, just an endless dark. And I could not catch my breath. It came in quick little gasps. I was having what my mother would have called a spell. Right there in the middle of the ocean. I was afraid of the silence I had craved. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I opened my door. I walked down the empty corridor. I found a door that led out to a small deck at the back of the ship. The night air hit me like a cold cloth. It was sharp and salty. It stung my cheeks. I gripped the railing. The ship was carving a path through the water, a great white wake spreading out behind us like a road made of moonlight. And the noise. It was the noise of the sea being parted, a rushing, roaring hush. I stood there and I forced myself to breathe with it, to match my inhale to the rise of the ship and my exhale to the crash of the bow wave. In and out, not little sips of air, great big gulps of it. I filled my lungs until they ached. I let the air out in a cloud of steam that the wind snatched away. And I did it again. And again. And then it happened. A thought came to me, not in words but in a feeling. It started in my toes and moved up through my body. It was a simple, undeniable fact. This air, this cold vast ocean air, it belonged to me. I was breathing it. No one was sharing it. No one was judging the sound of it. No one was waiting to speak over it. It was mine. This fundamental act, this thing I had done without thought since the moment I was born, had become a conscious choice. A reclaiming. With every breath I was saying, I am here. I am alive. I am taking this in for me. I began to cry. Not a sad cry. Not a happy cry. It was a release. The tears were warm on my cold face. They were the physical proof of all the breaths I had stifled. All the words I had swallowed. All the feelings I had compressed into a tiny hard ball in my chest. They were leaving me carried away on that salt wind. I cried for a long time. I cried until I was empty. And when I was done I breathed again. And this time it was easy. This time my shoulders dropped. My spine straightened. I stood at my full height at that railing and I breathed the whole night in. The next morning everything sounded different. My own footsteps in the corridor had a new rhythm. The clink of my coffee cup on the saucer was a clear note. But the loudest sound was the silence inside my own head. It was not the fearful silence of waiting. It was a spacious silence. A clean silence. I sat in the dining room and I ordered what I wanted. I did not think about what he would have chosen. I did not hear his voice in my head saying that's too rich for breakfast. When the waiter asked if everything was to my liking I paused. I truly considered the question. The taste of the orange juice. The sweetness of the melon. And I said yes. Yes it is. And I meant it. That simple sentence spoken on my own breath was a revelation. I spent days practicing my breath like it was a new language. I would find a quiet spot on deck and I would just breathe. I watched how my breath steamed in the Arctic air. I watched how it disappeared. I was not afraid of its disappearance anymore. Because I knew I could take another. And another. My breath became my anchor. It was the one thing that was entirely mine that no history, no person, no disappointment could take from me. It was the proof of my presence. I had spent a lifetime trying to prove my presence by doing. By cleaning, by cooking, by arranging, by accommodating, and all along the simplest, most elegant proof was right under my nose. The steady rising and falling of my own chest. One afternoon we passed a pod of whales. Their spouts shot up in the distance, great geysers against the gray sky. And I realized that was what I was witnessing. A breath. The whale's breath. A massive necessary expulsion so it could dive deep again. That breath was its power. Its freedom. Its life. And my own breath, small and human, was no different. It was my power. My freedom. My life. I had been diving deep into the dark, cold depths of a marriage that asked too much of me, and I had forgotten to come up for air. I had forgotten I was allowed to surface. I had forgotten the sky. When you hold your breath you are bracing for impact. You are preparing for something to hurt. For 33 years I had been braced. My body was a tense line waiting for the next small disappointment, the next casual dismissal. On that ship I finally exhaled. And in that exhale I let go of the brace. I surrendered the expectation of pain. It left my body like a spirit. And what flowed in to take its place was not joy, not exactly. It was capacity. A capacity to simply be. To experience the moment without the filter of his potential reaction. To see a beautiful thing and have the feeling belong entirely to me. To taste a new food and have the opinion be my own. My breath was the boundary. Inside this body with this breath is me. Everything outside of that is separate. It was the first and most important line I had ever drawn. And I drew it with air. I think of my mother near the end. She was in a hospital bed and every breath was a struggle. A raspy fought for thing. I would sit and hold her hand and match my breathing to hers, trying to will my strength into her. And she would look at me with those tired eyes and she would squeeze my hand. She was telling me to breathe. To breathe for both of us. To live a life that was not a struggle for air. I finally understood her message 40 years later, standing on the deck of a ship. So when I came home I brought my new breath with me. It was my secret, my weapon, my shield. The first time he made that sigh, the one that used to make my heart clench, I heard it differently. It was just a sound. A puff of air from a tired man. It did not belong to me. I did not have to catch it or hold it or let it diminish my own supply. I simply let it pass. And I took my next breath, my deep full breath. And the space between us in the room was no longer filled with my anxiety. It was filled with my calm. He felt the shift. He would look at me after one of his dismissals, waiting for the flinch, the apology, the shrinking. And I would just breathe. And look back. My steady breath was an answer to every unspoken argument. It said, I am still here. But I am not the here you are used to. I am here on my own terms. I am here in a body that takes up space and air. I am here, and my presence is no longer a question. It is a statement. That is the sound that was louder than any argument. The sound of my own breath. A sound so quiet it is almost nothing. A sound so powerful it changed everything. It was the first note of the song of myself. A song I had forgotten the words to. But you find the tune, by first finding the breath to carry it. There is a sound that can break you open not with violence but with scale. I had built my life inside a small quiet room of my own making. The walls were painted in shades of beige and compromise. The furniture was arranged for his comfort. The windows looked out onto a neatly trimmed lawn and a future that was a straight predictable line. In that room my hurts were the loudest things. A thoughtless comment would echo for days. A forgotten anniversary would swell to fill every corner. The silence over breakfast was a thunderous presence. I lived in a world where a sigh was a hurricane and a frown was an earthquake. My pain was real, do not mistake me. But it was a pain that lived in a snow globe. Self-contained, shaken up every few days to watch the same tiny storm swirl. Then I stood on the deck of that ship in Glacier Bay. The engines were cut. The tourists hushed. The only thing moving was the ice and the clouds and a single bald eagle riding a current of air so cold it felt holy. We drifted. We were a speck. A fleck of dust on the lens of creation. And before us was a wall. It was not a wall of rock. It was a wall of time. A cliff face of compressed centuries. A blue so profound it seemed to swallow light and memory. It was not the blue of a summer sky or a robin's egg. It was the blue of a deep vein. The blue of a twilight that lasts for months. The blue of a whisper from the beginning of the world. It stood there indifferent to our presence. It did not care about my marriage. It did not care about my lonely savings in a cookie jar. It did not care, and that was the most magnificent thing of all. We floated there for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the drip melt of ancient snow and the occasional crack, a sharp report like a gunshot across the water. Then the groaning started, a deep bass note that did not come through the air. It came up through the soles of my feet, through the deck of the ship, through the very water. It vibrated in the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of pressure, of unimaginable weight, of a patience so vast it had become a force. It was the glacier speaking in its only language, a language of strain and endurance. And then it happened, with a sound that defies description, a tearing, a shattering, a roaring collapse that was both incredibly fast and unbelievably slow. A piece of the face sheared away. A slab of ice the size of my house, my street, my entire neighborhood broke its ancient bonds and surrendered to gravity. It fell in a majestic, terrifying arc. It struck the water not with a splash but with a world-ending crash. A plume of white water exploded upward stories high. The sound reached us a second later, a physical wave of noise that hit my chest and made my heart stutter. Then came the waves, great rolling swells that lifted our massive ship as if it were a toy. We rose and fell on the wake of that single act of release. And then, silence again. A silence deeper than before. A ringing holy silence that was not empty but full of aftermath. Full of absence where the ice had been. The air sparkled with a million tiny ice crystals catching the sun. A rainbow appeared in the mist, a fragile bridge over the turmoil. And the glacier stood there with a new face, raw and brilliant blue, already telling a new story. I was weeping. Everyone around me was gasping or cheering or taking pictures. But I was weeping. I was not crying for the beauty of it, though it was beautiful. I was crying because in that cataclysm I saw my own life. My God, my little life. I had been that slab of ice. For decades, frozen in place, holding a shape that was not my own, bearing the immense crushing weight of expectations, my own and his and everyone else's. Frozen in a marriage that felt like a permanent landscape. I had been groaning under the pressure, making small cracks that no one else could hear. My hurts, my loneliness, my silent dinners, these were the tiny creaks and pops of my own slow-motion calving. And the argument I thought I needed to have. The big confrontation where I would finally say all the words and make him see. That was me waiting for someone else to provide the heat to thaw me. Waiting for an apology warm enough to melt my bonds. Waiting for a change in him that would cause my release. But the glacier does not wait for permission. It does not argue with the sun. It does not beg the sea to be softer. It reaches a point of pure physics, where its own weight, its own history, its own immense reality becomes too much for the frozen bonds to hold. And it breaks free not because it is angry but because it must. Because it is time. The roar of that ice was the loudest sound I have ever heard. And in its echo my problems did not vanish. They did not become trivial. They became specific. They became human-sized. They were no longer the entire landscape of my world. They were the small familiar furnishings in one room of a universe that also contained cathedrals of ice and mountains that pierced the clouds and seas so deep they held mysteries. My pain was real, but it was not the only reality. How can you stay clenched in anger over a man who forgot your birthday when you have just witnessed a millennium break apart and remake itself before your eyes? How can you simmer in resentment over a careless word when you have felt the tremor of a force that moves continents? It is not that your pain is meaningless. It is that it is not everything. There is a world beyond the walls of your hurt. A vast, cold, magnificent world that operates on a scale of eons, not emotions. That roar put me in my place. And my place was both insignificant and profoundly sacred. I was a tiny warm-blooded creature on a metal boat. And I was also a witness to glory. I was both. The woman with a heartache and the woman who stood in the presence of a god made of time and ice. I thought I needed to be heard. But in that moment I understood the power of being the one who hears. I heard the voice of the planet. And it told me that endings are not always tragedies. Sometimes an ending is a necessary release. A returning to source. That slab of ice did not die. It returned to the water. It became part of the sea again. It would rise as mist, fall as snow, and perhaps in 1,000 years be part of the glacier once more. It was a transformation, not a death. My marriage, my old life, that frozen shape I had been holding, it needed to calve. It needed to break away and fall into the sea of what was past. Not with a scream but with a roar of finality. Not to harm the shore but because the tension had become untenable. The weight of my silence had become greater than the fear of the splash. When the ship finally turned and sailed away, I looked back at the glacier, now a shining blue scar on the horizon. I touched my own cheek. It was wet and cold. I felt scraped clean, hollowed out, ready. I did not go home ready to fight. I went home ready to be. The roar had given me a new metric for sound. His irritated voice, his passive-aggressive sighs, the slamming of a cupboard door, these were the drips and pops of a small melting icicle. Annoying perhaps, but not catastrophic. I could listen to them from a new distance. From the perspective of the open sea. The first time he raised his voice after I returned a true shout over a misplaced bill, I simply looked at him. I watched the vein throb in his forehead. I heard the volume, and in my mind I held it up against the roar of the ice. His anger was a firecracker. A small sharp pop. It could not touch the deep places in me anymore. They were reserved for the groans of tectonic things. For the sound of my own soul shifting. That is what I found. A sound so vast it made a container for my grief. It did not dismiss my pain. It held it. It put it in a cathedral so large my sobs became echoes that faded before they reached the walls. In that container I could finally feel everything without being destroyed by it. The roar was not a weapon. It was a sanctuary, a reminder that there is a force in this world, in me, that is older, deeper, and more powerful than any disappointment, any man, any lonely night. It is the force of time. The force of change. The force that moves glaciers and men's hearts in its own slow, inevitable way. You do not need to see a glacier to hear it. You just need to listen beneath the noise of your daily hurts. Past the ticking clock and the buzzing phone and the sound of your own worried thoughts. There is a hum, a groan, a deep resonant note. It is the sound of your own life moving. Of pressure building toward release. Of weight becoming too much for the frozen places to bear. Do not be afraid of the roar when it comes. It is not the world ending. It is you returning to your source. Breaking free. Becoming part of the sea again. Ready to rise in a new form. For most of my life my thoughts were not my own. They were guests in a house where the television was always on. Where the radio in the garage blared talk shows full of other people's anger. Where his voice would come from another room asking a question that required an answer, a demand that broke the train of whatever I was thinking. My thoughts were like nervous birds. They would land for a moment on a branch, a memory of my grandmother's hands kneading dough, a line from a poem I loved in school, a wonder about why the sky turns that particular shade of lavender just before dusk, and then a door would slam. A phone would ring. He would clear his throat. And the birds would startle and fly away in a frantic flutter, leaving nothing behind but the faintest sense of a stirring. I lived in a state of perpetual interruption, and I began to believe that was the natural state of a woman's mind. A fractured thing, a thing meant to be pulled in a dozen directions, a mind that existed to answer to complete tasks, to anticipate needs. My own inner voice, the one that wondered and wandered and dreamed, became a whisper. And then a ghost. I forgot what it sounded like to have a complete thought. A thought that began in a quiet place, followed its own curious path, and reached its own conclusion without being yanked away to attend to something more urgent. More important. More his. On that ship in my little cabin I discovered a miracle. Silence. Not just an absence of noise, but a fertile, profound silence. An auditory blank page. For the first time in decades there was no next thing. No laundry waiting to be folded. No clock ticking toward the hour he would come home. No doorbell that might ring. There was only the low hum of the ship's engine, a steady planetary heartbeat, and the soft shush of the sea. It was a silence that held space. It was a room, and I was the only thing in it. At first the emptiness was terrifying. It felt like hunger, an ache. I would sit in the chair by the porthole and my hands would fidget in my lap. My mind would dart around looking for a purchase. I should be doing something. I should be planning. I should be worrying. I reached for the ghost of his needs, his schedule, his moods. But they were not there. The hooks were gone. I was unmoored, adrift in my own mind. It was a kind of madness. A peaceful, terrifying madness. So I just sat. I let the silence press in. I let the panic rise like a tide, and I did not fight it. I watched it, and then as if from a great distance I heard it. A thought. Not a worry. Not a to-do list. A simple, clean observation. The water is not one color. It is 1,000 grays. That was it. That was the thought. It came from a place behind my eyes. From the part of me that was simply looking. It had no purpose. It led nowhere. It asked for nothing. It was just a fact offered to me by my own senses. And it was whole. It began and it ended inside the quiet of my own head. No one interrupted it. No one asked what I was thinking. No one demanded to know why. I was just staring at the water. The thought was allowed to be, to linger, to dissolve back into the silence from which it came. And then another came. My mother had a scarf that color of gray, the one she wore to church in the winter. And with that a memory unfolded, not as a jarring intrusion but as a gentle invitation. I saw her standing by the old coal stove, her hands chapped from the washboard, the fine wool of that scarf at her throat. I felt the polished pew beneath my childish legs, the smell of wax and hymn books. I heard the sound of her singing slightly off-key, a sound I had not recalled in 40 years. The memory did not rush in and overwhelm me. It unspooled slowly, gracefully, like a ribbon falling. I followed its path. I felt its textures. I stayed with it until it was done. And then I let it go. The silence received it back. This was the music of uninterrupted thought. It was not a symphony with crashing cymbals and dramatic sweeps of strings. It was more like chamber music. A single cello in a quiet hall. A clear melodic line that could move from a memory of my mother's scarf to a feeling of sadness for how tired she always was, to a wondering about what her own private thoughts had been, to a gratitude for the warmth of my own coat. Each thought connected to the next, not by logic but by feeling. By a kind of intuitive thread. I was following my own mind. And I was fascinated by where it went. I had brought a journal. A beautiful leather-bound thing my son had given me one Christmas that had sat blank on my nightstand for years. I was afraid of it. Afraid of the emptiness of its pages. But in that cabin with the music of my own mind playing, I took it out. I uncapped the pen, and I did not try to write a story or a confession. I simply began to transcribe the thoughts. They came slowly at first, like the first drops of rain after a long drought. The pillowcase smells of clean starch and something else, something metallic like the air itself. The man who served coffee at breakfast had a gentleness in his eyes that reminded me of Mr. Henderson, who ran the pharmacy when I was a girl. He always gave me a cherry lollipop. There is a strange comfort in being a stranger to everyone. I was not writing for an audience. I was not writing to be profound. I was listening to the melody inside and writing down the notes. And as I wrote, a miraculous thing happened. The thoughts began to come more freely. They began to link together into something larger. A theme emerged. It was the theme of absence. Of the space left behind when the noise of a life is stripped away. And what fills that space? I wrote about the absence of his criticism and how it left room for my own evaluation of things. I wrote about the absence of meal times and how my body now told me when it was hungry for what it truly wanted. I wrote about the absence of a shared bed and how my sleep had become deep and dreamless, a sinking into a dark soft sea. The thoughts were not happy or sad. They were true. They were my own uninterrupted truth. And in their uninterrupted flow I began to recognize a voice. It was steady. It was kind. It was curious. It did not judge. It simply observed and felt and wondered. It was my voice, the one I had lost somewhere between saying, "I do," and learning to cook his meals exactly the way his mother made them. The voice of the girl who loved poetry. The voice of the young woman who once wanted to see Paris. The voice of the person I was before I became an annex to someone else's life. This was the music I had been starving for. The music of self. Back home my thoughts had been a cacophony, a jumble of reactions and defenses and plans. A constant rehearsing of conversations that would never happen. A frantic editing of my own words before I even spoke them. It was the sound of a mind trying to manage another person's emotions. A mind in survival mode. It was all dissonance and no resolution. Here in this silence my thoughts became a composition. They had rhythm. They had pauses. They had repetition like a refrain. The sight of a solitary albatross gliding beside the ship would appear in my thoughts again and again, each time revealing a new layer. First its grace, then its loneliness, then its immense strength, then my own longing for that kind of self-contained journey. The thought would circle and return deeper each time. This was contemplation. This was how a soul makes sense of itself. Not by frantic doing but by slow being. By allowing a single image, a single feeling to resonate until it yielded its meaning. One afternoon a storm gathered on the horizon. Great bruised clouds swallowing the sky. The sea turned the color of iron. People rushed inside to escape the coming rain. But I stayed on the sheltered side deck. I wanted to hear the storm in my thoughts before I heard it with my ears. I watched the lightning stitch the clouds together in silent flashes. And my mind was quiet. Not empty, but still. A deep receptive still. I was not thinking about the storm. I was being with it. I felt the charge in the air on my skin. I felt the ancient fear and awe rise in my chest. And a thought formed not in words but in a knowing. This is what power feels like. It is not control. It is the capacity to stand in the presence of a storm and not need to name it or tame it or hide from it. To let it be what it is. And to let yourself be what you are in response. That thought was a complete sentence. A thesis for my life. It arrived whole and perfect because for once nothing interrupted it. No one called my name. No practical concern pulled me away. The music of my mind had the space to arrive at its own conclusion. When I came home the noise rushed back in. The blare of the television. The grind of the lawnmower next door. The constant low-grade anxiety of the world. But I carried the music inside me. I had learned the trick. The silence was not out there. It was in the choice to listen inward. So in the middle of a dinner where he talked at me about politics I would retreat. Not visibly. My body remained. I would nod. But inside I would follow a single thought. The way the candlelight reflects in the dark of the window. I would follow that thought down its own quiet path. I would listen to its music. And his words would become background noise, a distant radio in another room. He would say, "Are you listening to me?" And I would say, "I heard you." And it was true. I had heard the sounds. But I had been listening to something else. Something more vital. The uninterrupted flow of my own existence. My own continuous unedited song. That music became my sanctuary. My rebellion. My home. He could fill the house with noise but he could not reach the quiet place where my thoughts now lived. They were no longer frightened birds. They had become whales deep in their own ocean singing long complex songs that only they could understand. They moved through the depths of me undisturbed by the weather on the surface. You have that music too. You have just forgotten how to listen for it. It is underneath the grocery lists and the calendar alerts and the worrying about everyone else. It is the hum of your own consciousness. The melody of your memory. The rhythm of your breath. To hear it you must carve out a silence, and then you must brave the terrifying emptiness of it. You must sit with the panic until it passes and the first true thought appears. And then, you must follow it, no matter how simple, no matter how strange. You must give it the courtesy of your full uninterrupted attention. That is how you find your way back to yourself. Not by a grand gesture, not by a dramatic leaving, but by listening to one complete thought at a time, by honoring the music of your own mind. It is the most intimate sound you will ever know, and it is louder than any voice that tries to talk over it. I learned the sound of my own footsteps. It seems a small thing, a thing so basic we never consider it, but for me it was a revelation, a private miracle in the dark. At home my footsteps were part of a chorus. They were answered by the click of his dress shoes on the foyer tile. They were preceded by the frantic scramble of the dog's nails. They were muffled by the thick pile of a carpet he chose. They were always in relation to something else. An echo, a response, a following. I walked to the kitchen because he was hungry. I walked to the laundry room because his shirts needed tending. I walked to the door because he was expected. My path was a worn circle from sink to stove to table to sofa. A well-trodden orbit around the sun of his presence. My footsteps had no destination of their own. They were a function, a service, a sound absorbed by the needs of the household. On that ship late at night I found a different walkway, a deck that wrapped around the stern. It was deserted after midnight. The tourists were asleep. The couples were nestled in their cabins. The crew was forward attending to their duties. It was just the sea and the stars and the metal of the ship and me. And I began to walk. The first thing I noticed was the sound. A solid, hollow clack from my sensible shoes. Then a pause. Then another clack. My own rhythm. Unrushed. Unobserved. There was no one to catch up to. No one to wait for. No one to follow. I set the pace. My hips, my knees, my ankles, they decided how fast or how slow. The sound was clean. It was mine. Each step was a declaration. I am here. I am moving. I am choosing this direction. I would walk to the end of the deck and stop at the railing. I would look out at the black water churning white in our wake. A road of moonlight and foam leading all the way back to where we had been. Then I would turn, and the sound would change. A different board would creak. A different muscle would engage. The clack 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 would begin again. A new path, just because I chose it. That echo, that lonely, beautiful echo. It proved something to me with every circuit. It proved I was the only one walking this path. I was the sole author of this particular journey. No one was ahead of me to set the course. No one was behind me to critique my speed. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was not walking in someone else's footsteps. I was not walking in the ghost of my own past steps from yesterday or last week. I was making a fresh track in the cold night air, and the sound of it was the sound of freedom. It brought back a memory so sharp it stole my breath. I was a girl maybe 8 years old. It was winter and the first deep snow had fallen. I got up before the sun, before my father could fire up the snowblower. I put on my boots and my coat and I went out into the untouched white of the backyard. And I walked. I made the first footprints. A looping crazy path all my own. A circle, a zigzag, a figure 8. The sound was a deep, satisfying crunch with every step. I was the first one. The only one. I remember the feeling in my chest. It was a wild, joyous pride. I had made a mark. I had changed the landscape. However temporarily, it was my pattern, my design. I had not felt that feeling in 50 years. On that deck I was that girl again. The snow was the clean planks. The silence of the morning was the silence of the deep ocean night. And my footsteps were the same sound of invention. I was not walking to get somewhere. I was walking to feel the walk. To hear the proof of my own movement. To know that I could change my mind at any railing. I could go left or right or stand perfectly still. The choice was a physical thing in my legs. I thought about all the paths I had taken because they were expected. The aisle at the wedding. The hallway to the maternity ward. The worn path from the parking lot to the office where I did the bookkeeping. The tired trudge from the car to the grocery store. Each one was a route laid down by obligation or necessity. I never once stopped in the middle of that grocery store aisle and thought, I could go a different way. I could leave this cart right here and walk out the door and just keep walking. The possibility was not even a ghost. It was unthinkable, but on that deck it was all I could think. Because with every step I was enacting the possibility. I was proving it with sound. Clack. I am going this way. Clack. I am still going. Clack. Now I am turning around. One night a storm was brewing. Not a fierce one but a gentle rolling one. The ship began to sway in a long, slow dance. The deck tilted beneath my feet. I had to adjust my balance. My footsteps became a careful, deliberate thing. A clack, a pause to steady, another clack. I was not afraid. I was engaged. I was in a conversation with the movement of the world. The ship would lean and my body would answer. My foot would find its place. It was a new kind of partnership. Not with a person but with the elements. With gravity and momentum. It asked for my full attention. And in giving it I forgot everything else. There was only the next step. The next secure placement of my soul on the wood. The next sound in the rhythm. It was meditation. It was prayer. It was the purest thing I had ever done. And in the midst of that walking a truth settled into my bones. It didn't come as a thought. It came as a knowing in the soles of my feet. I am the only one in my body. This vessel that carries me, it answers to me. Its direction is mine to choose. Its balance is mine to find. Its path, however much it sways, is mine to walk. For decades I had let another person's desires and moods and preferences chart the course. I had let his emotional weather dictate my gait. If he was stormy I walked on tiptoe. If he was sunny I walked with a forced cheer. I had forgotten how to walk in my own weather. The echo of my footsteps on that empty deck became the sound of my own authority. It was a quiet sound. It didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be consistent. To be the only sound of its kind in that vast, dark space. It was my signature written in sound waves on the air. When I came home the first thing I noticed was the carpet. How it swallowed sound. How it made my movements silent, secret. I felt like a ghost in my own house. So I started wearing shoes in the house. Not outdoor shoes, but a pair of soft-soled moccasins that had a distinct, gentle shush on the hardwood floors. I needed to hear myself move. I needed that auditory proof. He noticed, of course. "Why are you wearing shoes in the house?" he asked one evening, his eyes on the television. "I like the sound," I said simply. He shook his head, that familiar gesture of dismissal. A what nonsense gesture. But I didn't let it alter my stride. I kept walking. Shush, shush, shush from the kitchen to the living room. I was no longer following the old orbit. I was cutting new paths. From my reading chair directly to the garden door, bypassing his recliner entirely. From the hallway into the spare room, which I had begun to clear out, just to stand in the empty space and hear the different acoustics. My footsteps began to carve new neural pathways in our home. They marked a new territory. My territory. Not a room with a lock, but a pattern of movement that belonged to me. He would be sitting in his chair, and he would hear my footsteps moving in a way they never had before. Not serving, not fetching, not circling. Just moving. With intention. With a destination he did not automatically know. One Saturday morning I put on my coat. He was at the table with the newspaper. Going to the store, he asked without looking up. It was the assumed destination. The only destination. "No," I said. "I'm going for a walk." Now he looked up. Confusion. "A walk? Where?" "I don't know yet," I said. And I opened the door and stepped out. I walked down our street, past the houses that all looked like variations of our own. But I didn't turn toward the shopping plaza. I took the left that led to the old park, the one with the creek. I hadn't been there in years. My footsteps on the pavement were firm. The sound was different than on the ship's deck, but the meaning was the same. Clack, clack, clack. I am going this way. The choice was in my legs. I followed the path by the creek until it ended. Then I turned around and came back. A simple, pointless, beautiful walk. For no reason other than to hear myself go, and to hear myself return. When I came back, he was still at the table. The paper was lowered. He watched me hang up my coat. "Everything all right?" he asked. It was coded language for your behavior is unexplained and therefore unsettling. "Everything is fine," I said. And my footsteps, as I walked to the kitchen to make my own tea, said the rest. Clack, clack, clack. I am fine. I am here. I am moving under my own power. The echo of my footsteps had come home with me. It was no longer an echo off metal and sea. It was an echo off the walls of my life. A constant, gentle reminder that I am the one walking this path. I may be walking it within the structure of a marriage, within the walls of a house we share. But the steps are mine. The direction, however circumscribed, is my choice. The sound of my own movement is the music of my own agency. It is a quiet, relentless, undeniable proof. You can start to hear it too. You just have to go somewhere alone, even if it's just to the end of your own driveway at night. And walk. Listen to the sound of one set of footsteps. Not in relation to anyone else's. Just yours. The sound of a single journey. However small, however short, let that echo be your teacher. It will tell you everything you need to know about who is leading your life. One step, and one clear sound, at a time. For 33 years I had conversations that were really negotiations. They were transactions in the economy of our marriage. I spoke and I waited for his reaction, the correction, the sigh, the subtle eye roll that devalued my words. I listened not to understand him but to anticipate him. To navigate the hidden reefs of his moods. My words were chosen like small, careful stones meant to skip across the surface of his attention without sinking into the depths of his displeasure. His words were often pronouncements. Statements of fact about the world as he saw it. They were not invitations. They were periods at the end of sentences I had not been allowed to help write. In that dining room on the ship everything was different. The waiters glided between tables with a professional grace. They held out a chair for me. They placed a heavy linen napkin in my lap. And when they spoke it was with a clean, clear question that had only one honest answer. And for the lady today, the soup or the salad? That was all. No history lived in that question. No knowledge of what I usually had. No expectation based on what he was having. It was a fresh inquiry directed at the woman in the blue sweater sitting alone. It was my palate, my hunger, my choice. And when I answered, "The soup please," it was a statement that existed in a vacuum. It was not compared. It was not judged. It was simply received. Excellent choice. And he would move on. This exchange was a revelation. It was a conversation that began and ended in a single, graceful loop. It asked for nothing more than a preference. It offered no opinion on the preference given. It was clean. It was free. I began to listen to the conversations around me not with envy but with a kind of anthropological curiosity. At the next table a family celebrated a birthday. Their laughter was a bright, tangled melody. At a larger table a group of friends told stories that began with, "Do you remember when?" Their history was a shared country they visited together with every sentence. And then there were the couples. Some leaned into each other, their words soft and private. Others sat in a silence that was either comfortable or fraught, I could never tell. I observed it all from the gentle island of my own table. I was not outside of life. I was a witness to its many forms. And my solitude was not a loneliness. It was a vantage point. One morning an older gentleman at the next table caught my eye. He was alone as well. He had a kind face etched with lines that spoke of smiles not frowns. He raised his coffee cup in a small, silent salute. I nodded back. The next day he was there again. As I got up to leave he spoke. His voice was warm like worn leather. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "But I've noticed you seem to be enjoying the silence as much as I am." That was all. It was not a pickup line. It was not a demand. It was an observation offered like a gift. I paused. I said. "It's a different kind of noise, isn't it?" He smiled. "The best kind." He gestured to the window where a whale had breached moments before. "It leaves room for that." And that was it. He returned to his paper. I went to my walk. But that tiny exchange lived in me. It was a conversation that existed for its own sake. For the simple human acknowledgement of a shared moment. It was unburdened by expectation. It did not need to lead to a lunch date or a promise or an exchange of life stories. It was complete in itself. A passing cloud of connection that then moved on. It was so light it could float. I thought of the weight of my conversations at home. How each one was freighted with the cargo of years. A simple, "How was your day?" was not a question. It was a minefield. Would he actually tell me? Would he grunt and turn away? Would my account of my own day be met with interest or impatience? Our words were never just words. They were carriers of old resentments, of disappointments, of unmet needs that had crusted over like ancient wounds. We didn't have conversations. We performed the rituals of conversation, hoping the other wouldn't notice the hollow core. Here on this ship words were new. They were born in the moment and they died in the moment. The bartender who learned my name and remembered I liked a twist of lemon. His "Good evening, Eleanor" was a gift because he had chosen to remember. There was no obligation in it. The lady from Winnipeg I spoke to for 10 minutes in the gift shop about the peculiar quality of the light at sea. We shared no past. We would likely share no future. But for those 10 minutes we built a tiny, beautiful bridge between our experiences. Then we said, "Enjoy the rest of your trip," and we meant it. And we walked away. There was a profound honesty in these exchanges precisely because they were temporary. Because they owed me nothing. They were not investments in a shared future. They were simply expenditures of human kindness in the present. I could be entirely myself, or a version of myself I was experimenting with, because the stakes were so beautifully low. There was no permanent record. No consequence lasting beyond the sound of my voice in the air. One afternoon I sat in the observation lounge writing in my journal. A young woman, maybe my daughter's age, sat down nearby. She was crying, not loudly, but the quiet, shaking tears of someone trying very hard not to be seen. I didn't say anything. I just slid my packet of tissues across the small table between us. She looked up, startled, then grateful. She took one. "Thank you," she whispered. "The sea air is harsh on the eyes," I said softly, not looking directly at her, giving her privacy. She let out a wet, choked laugh. "It really is." I went back to my writing. A few minutes later she spoke, her voice small. "I called off my wedding. A month ago. This was supposed to be the honeymoon." I closed my journal. I didn't offer advice. I didn't tell her it was for the best. I simply said, "That must have taken tremendous courage." She looked at me then, really looked. Everyone at home is either mad at me or feels sorry for me. No one just acknowledges that it was hard. "It's hard," I said. A simple echo. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yeah, it is." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sea. Then she stood up. "Thank you," she said again. "For the tissue. And for not, you know." "I know," I said. And she left. That was the entire conversation. It was one of the most intimate of my life. It was built on nothing but shared, unadorned truth. There was no role for me to play other than human being. I was not a wife, not a mother, not a caretaker. I was just a woman on a ship who had tissues and a little room in her silence for someone else's pain. Her words were not a burden passed to me. They were a release, and I was simply the witness. I owed her no follow-up, no check-in, no long-term emotional management. The transaction was complete, holy, and clean. This was the sound I had been missing. The sound of words that were simply what they were. Not weapons, not tools for manipulation, not carefully crafted defenses, just words, floating between two people for a moment before dissipating into the air. When I returned home the contrast was deafening. Robert's words came at me like stones, each one weighted with its old meaning. A simple, "Did you pay the electric bill?" was not a question about utilities. It was a test, an accusation of potential failure, a stone dropped into the pond of my day, and I was expected to manage the ripples. But I had learned a new language. I began to hear the difference. I started to respond not to the old, heavy subtext, but to the simple, surface meaning of the words. It disarmed him. "Did you pay the electric bill?" He'd ask, his tone edged with that familiar impatience. "Yes, I did," I'd say, my voice calm as that inland sea. And then I would stop. I would not elaborate. I would not defend my timeliness. I would not ask if there was a problem. I would let the simple, clean answer hang in the air. The transaction, as far as the words were concerned, was complete. He would blink, thrown off. The old script required my fluster, my defensiveness. My calm, factual reply was a non sequitur. It ended the volley before it could begin. My words, once porous and absorbent, soaking up his anxiety, had become Teflon. Clean, slippery, impenetrable. I also stopped using words to fill his silences. When he would retreat into one of his moods, the heavy, punishing quiet, I no longer scurried after him with 1,000 chirping questions and offerings. Are you okay? What's wrong? Can I get you something? I let his silence be his. I inhabited my own, and my silence, now, was not a nervous one. It was the rich, full silence I had brought home from the sea. A silence that spoke of contentment, not fear. He did not know what to do with this woman who answered questions directly and was unafraid of quiet. My words became fewer, but each one carried more weight because it was true, and it was final. They were no longer part of a negotiation. They were simple declarations of fact or gentle, firm boundaries. I will be going to the garden center this afternoon. I prefer not to discuss that right now. No, thank you. Each one was a clean, clear note in the new, spare music of my life. They were echoes of those shipboard conversations, with the waiter, with the stranger, with the grieving young woman. They owed him nothing but the truth they contained. They asked for nothing in return but to be heard. I had learned that the most powerful conversations are often the ones that are not about you at all. They are the exchanges that remind you that you are part of the great, humming web of humanity, where kindness can be given and received in the space of a sentence, with no down payment and no debt incurred. They are the proof that you can connect without being consumed. That you can speak without sacrificing your peace. That you can listen without taking on the burden. And sometimes, the kindest word you can offer, to others and to yourself, is a clean, simple, honest no. Or a yes. Or a silent slide of a tissue across a table. It is a sentence that begins and ends with itself. A conversation that is free. There is a place beyond happiness. A place beyond the frantic chase for joy which is so often just a reaction to pain. I did not know this place existed. I thought the goal was to be happy or to be right or to be loved. I thought contentment was a milder, quieter form of happiness. I was wrong. Contentment is something else entirely. It is a country of its own. And its border is silence. Not a silence you fall into but a silence you choose. A silence you build around you like a glass bell. And inside that bell, there is no noise. No argument can live there. No plea for understanding can breathe there. No lingering resentment can take root. It is a sterile field for conflict. A vacuum where the shouts of the world simply vanish. I found that silence on the ship. But it was not the silence of the sea or the solitude. Those were just the conditions that allowed me to hear it. The silence I found was inside my own chest. A stillness so complete it had a sound all its own. It was the sound of a clock that has stopped ticking. The sound of a river that has reached the sea. The sound of a question that no longer needs an answer. It did not come all at once. It arrived in the space between breaths on that third day. I was sitting in a deck chair wrapped in a wool blanket. A book lay open but unread in my lap. I was not thinking. I was not remembering. I was not planning or wishing or regretting. I was simply being. A warm animal in the sun on a moving ship. And a feeling came over me that had no name. It was not joy. Joy is a spark, a leap in the chest. This was a settling. A deep, gravitational settling, as if every particle of me had been gently shaken and had now found its rightful, resting place. This was contentment. And its voice was a deafening silence. It said, I need nothing. Not, I have everything I want. But, I need nothing. From this moment, from this view, from this life, from him, that silence was the final, unanswerable argument. Because you cannot argue with needlessness. You cannot bargain with sufficiency. You cannot guilt-trip a person who has found a complete circle within themselves. All the strategies, all the weapons we use in our quiet domestic wars, the cold shoulder, the barbed compliment, the sigh of martyrdom, the explosive accusation, they all require a hook. They require that the other person needs something from you, your attention, your apology, your love, your fear, your reaction. My silence had no hooks. It was smooth and impenetrable. It was a closed system. I thought of all the years I had tried to argue my way into being seen. To explain my feelings as if presenting a legal case. When you do X, it makes me feel Y. I believed if I could just find the right words, the perfect combination of logic and emotion, I could make him understand. I could make him care. But the understanding never came. The caring never changed. My arguments were like seeds thrown onto a parking lot, they had no soil. to take root in. I was arguing with a man who was not even in the courtroom. On that deck, in the hum of that inner silence, I realized I had been prosecuting a case that had already been dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. My need for him to be different was the crime scene, and I was the only one left standing in it. So I dropped the case. I let the silence settle over the entire proceeding like dust. I granted myself a pardon, and the peace that came with it was not fragile. It was robust. It was made of granite and sea air. It could withstand any weather. When you are content, you become a mirror. And people do not always like what they see reflected back. When I returned home, Robert saw his own reflection in my silence. He saw a man living with a woman who was fine. A woman who was not waiting for him to come home. A woman who was not hanging on his words. A woman who did not light up when he entered a room nor dim when he left it. She was just present. A calm, pleasant presence. And to a person who has built their identity on being the sun around which another orbits, a self-contained planet is a terrifying thing. He tried to argue with the silence. He would pick fights over nothing. The brand of coffee I bought. The volume of the television. He was trying to draw me out. To get a reaction, any reaction, to prove I still needed the drama, needed the engagement, needed him to spark an emotion in me. It was like shouting into a well and hearing only your own echo come back. My contentment absorbed his noise and gave back nothing but a faint, peaceful reverberation. "Why are you so quiet?" he snapped one evening, after a monologue of his had been met with my serene, nodding silence. "I'm just listening," I said. And it was true. I was listening to the peace inside me. His words were just distant radio static. "You're not even here," he accused, his voice frayed with a new kind of panic. I looked at him then, really looked. And I saw the fear in his eyes. He was right. The part of me he was used to, the anxious, eager to please, emotionally hungry part, wasn't there anymore. It had been left at sea. I had come home a stranger, a woman who was perfectly polite and perfectly whole. And a whole woman is a fortress. You cannot storm the gates of someone who isn't at war. My contentment became my final statement. It was the closing argument I never had to speak. It said, "I am no longer waiting for you to make me happy. I am no longer keeping score of your failures. I am no longer a tenant in the house of your moods. I have moved into a smaller, quieter room within myself, and the rent is paid in full." He would bring me flowers. Tulips, already wilting. A gesture that once would have sent me into a whirlwind of hope and analysis. Does this mean he's changing? Does he finally see me? Now, I would thank him politely, put them in water, and appreciate their brief beauty for what it was, a gesture from a confused man. Nothing more. No secret message. No bridge back to the past. Just flowers on a Tuesday. My contentment allowed me to receive the gift without mortgaging my peace for the meaning behind it. The hardest thing for him to bear, I think, was my smile. It was a new smile. It didn't come from him. It wasn't a reward for something he'd done. It would appear when I was reading a good book, or when the afternoon light hit the maple tree in the backyard just so. It was a private smile, emanating from that inner silence. He would see it and he would be utterly locked out. He couldn't claim it. He couldn't inspire it. He couldn't even really share it. It belonged to me in the moment, and there was no room for him in it. That silent, self-sufficient joy was the loudest rebuke to all the years he had told me, through word and deed, that my happiness was his to dispense or withhold. I had found the core of my own being. And at that core, there was no argument. There was no, "You did this to me." There was only, "I am." And, "I am," is a complete sentence. It requires no object. It points to no other. It simply is. This is the terrifying, magnificent power of a woman who has stopped needing. Her silence is not submission. It is sovereignty. Her calm is not compliance. It is conquest, not of him, but of her own desperate, aching self. She has won the war by declaring the battlefield irrelevant. She has laid down the weapons of expectation and picked up the shield of sufficiency. The world wants women to be loud in our pain, to perform our heartbreak, to narrate our struggles. There is a place for that. But there is a deeper power in the quiet that comes after the struggle is over. Not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet of a settled land. The quiet of a forest after a storm has passed, where the only sound is the drip of water from leaf to earth, and the slow, sure work of regrowth. That is the silence I carry with me now. It is the sound of my own completion. And it echoes through the halls of my life, leaving no space for the old, frantic noises. His regret, his confusion, his late attempts, they are just faint, faraway sounds, like a radio playing in another house. I can hear them, but they have nothing to do with me. My dear friend, you may never stand on the deck of a ship in the Alaskan quiet. But you can find this silence. It is in the moment you stop waiting for the phone to ring with his apology. It is in the breath you take when you decide his opinion of you is no longer your business. It is in the small, solid smile you offer your own reflection when you realize you are enough. That you have always been enough. Build your glass bell of silence. Let it be your fortress. And inside it, tend the quiet, deafening garden of your own contentment. It is the most powerful argument you will ever make. And it wins without saying a single word. That's the place. Right there. In the pause. That's where you hear it. Not in the shouting. Not in the clever words. Not in the storm or the calving ice or even the footsteps. You hear it in the space after. In the quiet that you choose to let linger. That's where the truth settles. Like sediment in a glass of water, when you stop stirring, it all goes clear. They think silence is nothing. An absence. A void where words should be. But they have it backwards. Silence is the everything. It's the container. It's the room where all the real things live. The understanding. The knowing. The decision that changes a life. It doesn't happen in the crash. It happens in the quiet that follows. I could feel him waiting, for the rest of my sentence. For the tear. For the slam of a door. For the performance of my pain he knew so well. He was braced for the noise. He had his arguments ready on the tip of his tongue, his justifications lined up like soldiers. But I gave him the pause. I let it stretch. I let it become a country. I let him stand on the border of it and look in at my calm, my settled dust, my finished business. And in that vast, unbroken quiet, his own words, they just dried up. Withered. Fell away. Because there was nothing for them to push against anymore. My peace was a wall of feathers. You can't punch a wall of feathers. Your fist just goes through and you lose your balance. So take your pause, darling. Don't be afraid of it. It's not empty. It's full of you. The real you, before the world told you who to be. Sit in it. Let them squirm. Let them fill it with their chatter, their blame, their noise. You just, stay quiet. Your silence isn't giving up. It's gathering up. It's collecting all the pieces of you that got scattered in all that noise and bringing them back home. The most powerful thing you will ever say. So here we are, my dear. At the final page. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of the understanding. I did not go looking for a roar. I went looking for a little quiet. A break in the noise of my own life. And I found that in the deepest quiet, there is a sound that changes everything. It's the sound of your own soul settling. The click of a lock when you didn't even know you held the key. They will tell you to speak up. To use your voice. And there is a time for that, yes. But there is a greater power in discovering the voice you use when you are speaking only to yourself. The one that doesn't argue, doesn't plead, doesn't explain. The one that simply says, I see now. The cookie jar is empty. The porch light is off. The path is my own. And the silence, this beautiful, deafening silence, is mine to keep. You carry your own quiet within you. You have just forgotten how to listen for it. So start small, with one breath that belongs entirely to you. One step taken for no reason at all. One moment where you let the question hang in the air, unanswered. Tend to that quiet. Protect it. It is the most precious thing you own. It is not the grand gestures that remake a life. It is the small, silent knowings. The realization that you have been breathing shallow for years. The decision, felt in the bones, to take a deeper breath. And then another. That is the journey. From a whisper, to a breath, to a roar so deep it sounds like peace. Thank you for walking this path with me. For listening. Now, my dear, go and listen for yourself.